In a vibrant courtroom at the core of a quaint southern town, a privileged young socialite makes her entrance, adorned in designer attire and an air of self-importance. Facing her is a pragmatic black judge, a man whose calm authority is as unwavering as the legal principles he upholds. What transpires when entitlement clashes with justice? Witness an arrogant young woman confront a stern judge and gain an unforgettable life lesson. It was a crisp winter morning in Brookfield, Georgia. The courthouse, with its white columns standing tall against the muted gray sky, occupied the town square's center. This quiet community was seldom stirred by significant events, yet today was different. Whispers had spread about a high-profile hearing, one that threatened to expose imperfections within the community's facade of perfection. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere buzzed with hushed anticipation. The courtroom was already filled, a mosaic of familiar and new faces. Townspeople murmured, speculating about the judge's impending pronouncements. Older residents quietly suggested that the town's spoiled youth needed a reality check, while others impatiently checked their watches, eager for the proceedings to commence. This was no ordinary case. Today, Chantel Rivers, the 23-year-old heiress of one of Brookfield's wealthiest families, was scheduled to appear before Judge Malcolm Stokes. Chantel's name was synonymous with affluence and controversy, her escapades ranging from extravagant gatherings to reckless driving. However, it was the most recent incident, a near miss that left a retired teacher injured, that finally brought her to court. At 9:15 a.m., just as the bailiff prepared to call the session to order, the heavy oak doors swung open. All heads turned as Chantel Rivers sauntered into the room, unapologetically tardy. Draped in an ivory coat, designer sunglasses perched atop her impeccably styled hair, she radiated an aura of self-importance. She paused in the central aisle, surveying the room with mild disinterest as if it were beneath her. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she made her way to the defense table. Trailing behind her was her lawyer, David Morton, a man clearly accustomed to mitigating the repercussions of Chantel's behavior. Morton appeared visibly uneasy, his shoulders hunched as he urgently whispered something to her. Chantel dismissively waved him off with a manicured hand, placing her oversized handbag on the table with a resounding thud. The murmuring in the room intensified. Even the seasoned court reporter glanced up from her machine, raising an eyebrow at the spectacle. Chantel removed her sunglasses with an exaggerated flourish, her expression one of pure ennui. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if daring anyone to challenge her. Moments later, the door at the front of the courtroom opened, and the atmosphere instantly transformed. A hush descended as Judge Malcolm Stokes entered. Standing over 6 feet tall, with a commanding presence and a keen gaze that seemed to penetrate pretense, Judge Stokes exuded authority. His dark suit was impeccably pressed, and his demeanor was as serene as it was unyielding. At 62, he carried the weight of years spent navigating the intricacies of justice, and his reputation preceded him. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room stood in near unison. Chantel hesitated, rolling her eyes before reluctantly rising. The judge noticed but remained silent. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, settled into his chair, and opened the file before him. "Be seated," he instructed, his voice even but firm. The courtroom obeyed, the creak of wooden benches punctuating the silence. Judge Stokes's sharp eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Chantel, who was now tapping her nails against the table with slow, rhythmic impatience. He let his gaze linger just long enough to ensure she noticed, then returned his attention to the file. "Today's case involves Ms. Chantel Rivers," the judge began, his voice effortlessly carrying across the room. "The charges include reckless driving and endangerment, stemming from an incident 2 weeks ago involving a pedestrian, Mr. Hector Jones." Chantel shifted in her seat, leaning back further as if to distance herself from the gravity of the moment. Her lawyer leaned in again, whispering something meant to temper her behavior, but Chantel merely shrugged, her expression dismissive. Judge Stokes continued, unfazed by her demeanor. "This court acknowledges that Ms. Rivers has been cited multiple times for traffic violations, including illegal parking, speeding, and failure to yield. However, the incident involving Mr. Jones elevates this case beyond a mere citation. It raises questions about the defendant's regard for public safety and personal accountability." Chantal let out a loud, theatrical sigh, earning a few sharp glances from those seated nearby. Judge Stokes paused, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the bench. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. "Miss Rivers," he said, looking directly at her, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Chantal met his gaze with a smirk. "Yeah, sure," she said, her tone dripping with indifference. "Some parking tickets and a guy who got spooked. No big deal." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Even her lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. Judge Stokes remained composed, though his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Miss Rivers," he said, his voice steady, "in this courtroom, we adhere to a certain standard of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Chantal raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied with mock enthusiasm, twirling a strand of her blonde hair between her fingers. Gasps echoed softly from the gallery. Judge Stokes leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together as though contemplating his next words carefully. "Let me remind you, Miss Rivers," he said, "this is not a red carpet event, nor is it a stage for your theatrics. This is a court of law where your actions and your attitude carry consequences." The room fell silent. Chantal's smirk faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes as though none of this mattered. Her lawyer leaned in again, speaking urgently in a low voice, but Chantal waved him off a second time. Judge Stokes let the silence linger, the weight of his presence filling the room. It was clear to everyone watching that the judge was not a man to be trifled with, and yet Chantal remained oblivious to the storm she was inviting. The courtroom sat on edge, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even the most seasoned court regulars leaned forward in their seats, their attention fixed on Judge Stokes and the unapologetic defendant before him. And so began a clash between privilege and justice, one that would leave no doubt about who held the final say in this courtroom. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Malcolm Stokes deliberately adjusted his glasses, his calm yet firm demeanor commanding everyone's attention. All eyes were on Chantal Rivers, whose dismissive attitude continued to exude entitlement. Her slouched posture in her chair, arms crossed, starkly contrasted with the proceedings' formality. Judge Stokes leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Chantal. "Ms. Rivers," he said, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable weight, "let us proceed with the facts of this case. 2 weeks ago you were operating a vehicle in downtown Brookfield when you allegedly ignored a red light and accelerated through a crosswalk, nearly striking a pedestrian. This pedestrian, Mr. Hector Jones, fell in his attempt to avoid your vehicle and sustained injuries to his wrist." Chantal's eyes darted briefly to her lawyer, David Morton, who gave her a look that could only be described as a plea for restraint. But Chantal merely rolled her eyes and leaned back further in her chair, letting out a soft, exaggerated sigh. Judge Stokes paused, his hands clasped on the bench as he let the silence stretch. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but firm. "Miss Rivers, do you dispute these facts?" "Not really," Chantal shrugged casually, "but it's not like I hit him or anything. He's fine. People just overreact." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Even the court reporter hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. Chantal's words hung in the air, a glaring reminder of the chasm between her perception and the reality of her actions. Judge Stokes's expression remained unchanged, but the atmosphere in the room shifted as he reached for a document on the bench. "Miss Rivers," he said, "before we proceed further, I'd like to introduce someone who can provide a first-hand account of that day. Mr. Hector Jones, would you please stand?" In the second row of the gallery, a man in his late 60s slowly rose to his feet. Mr. Jones was a slender figure, his arm in a sling, his face etched with years of hard work and quiet resilience. Despite the visible discomfort of his injury, his demeanor was calm, almost solemn. He met Chantal's gaze briefly before looking toward the judge. "Mr. Jones," Judge Stokes began, "can you describe what happened on the day of the incident?" Mr. Jones nodded, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the memory. "I was crossing the street, Your Honor. The light was green for pedestrians and I thought it was safe. But as I stepped into the crosswalk, I heard an engine rev and the next thing I knew, her car was coming straight at me. I tried to move out of the way but I tripped and fell. That's how I hurt my wrist." The gallery was silent, the gravity of Mr. Jones's words sinking in. Chantal shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering for a split second, but she quickly masked it with a bored expression, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "Thank you, Mr. Jones," Judge Stokes said, his tone respectful. "And how has this injury affected your daily life?" Mr. Jones glanced at his arm, then back at the judge. "It's been difficult. I volunteer at the community center and it's hard to do my work with one hand. I've also had to visit the doctor multiple times and the pain hasn't gone away." Chantal's lawyer leaned over again, whispering urgently, but she waved him off once more. "Okay, but I didn't hit him," she said aloud, her tone defensive. "It's not like I meant for him to fall." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a mix of disbelief and disapproval. Mr. Jones sat back down, his expression calm but weary. The quiet disappointment in his eyes seemed to pierce through Chantal's bravado, though she refused to acknowledge it. Judge Stokes closed the file in front of him with deliberate precision, the soft thud reverberating through the room. "Miss Rivers," he began, his voice carrying an edge that commanded silence, "your perspective on this matter is troubling, not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the consequences of your actions." Chantal blinked, her posture stiffening slightly. "I said I didn't hit him," she repeated, her voice defensive. "Why does everyone keep acting like I'm some kind of criminal?" Judge Stokes raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "Criminality, Miss Rivers, is not merely a matter of intent. It is also a matter of impact. Your actions, whether intentional or not, placed another person in harm's way. Dismissing this as an overreaction does not absolve you of responsibility." Chantal opened her mouth to respond, but Judge Stokes continued, his tone growing colder. "Let me make this perfectly clear. This courtroom does not exist to shield individuals from accountability. It exists to ensure that justice is served, for the injured, for the community, and for those who believe they are above the law." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Chantal's lawyer sat frozen, his attempts to manage her behavior now futile. Even Chantal, who had spent most of the hearing feigning indifference, seemed momentarily unsettled. Judge Stokes reached for another document on the bench, this time a set of medical records detailing Mr. Jones's injuries. "The law is not measured by the severity of harm alone, Miss Rivers," he said. "It is measured by the choices we make and the impact those choices have on others. And in this case, your choices have demonstrated a pattern of recklessness and disregard for the safety of those around you." Chantal shifted in her seat again, her confidence visibly eroding. For the first time, she seemed to realize that this was more than just another inconvenience to be brushed aside. Judge Stokes leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto Chantal. "Do you believe, Miss Rivers, that your actions should have no consequences?" Chantal hesitated, her usual bravado faltering under the intensity of the judge's stare. "I don't know," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "That, Miss Rivers," Judge Stokes said, his tone soft but firm, "is precisely the problem." The tension in the room reached its peak. All eyes were on Chantal, whose earlier confidence had all but evaporated. For the first time, the privilege that had shielded her from accountability seemed to crack, leaving her exposed to the reality of her actions. And Judge Stokes wasn't finished yet. The courtroom was about to witness a decision that would ensure Chantal would never forget this day. The courtroom remained silent, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Malcolm Stokes sat back in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on Chantal Rivers. The smirk that had once adorned her face was now replaced by an uneasy frown. Her earlier confidence was crumbling, yet a flicker of defiance still lingered in her posture. "Miss Rivers," Judge Stokes began, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of authority, "your dismissive attitude and refusal to accept accountability are as concerning as the incident itself. This court exists not only to address violations of the law but to uphold the principles of responsibility and empathy." Chantal shifted in her seat, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her designer coat. Her lawyer, David Morton, leaned over again, whispering something urgent, but she barely acknowledged him. Instead, she raised her chin slightly, attempting to regain some semblance of control. Judge Stokes tapped his pen lightly against the bench, the rhythmic sound echoing through the silent room. "I've reviewed your case extensively, Miss Rivers," he continued. "I've also reviewed your record, a record that includes multiple traffic violations, most of which were dismissed with minimal consequences. Chantal stiffened, her cheeks flushing slightly. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a mix of whispers and quiet nods. Judge Stokes allowed the room to settle before continuing. "This pattern of behavior," he said, his tone unwavering, "indicates a troubling disregard for the safety and well-being of others. But more importantly, it reveals an individual who has never been truly held accountable for their actions." Judge Stokes reached for a document on the bench, glancing at it briefly before looking back at Chantal. "Miss Rivers, the law allows this court to impose fines, probation, or even jail time for charges such as yours. However, I do not believe that such measures would address the root of the issue." Chantal's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, a flicker of genuine concern crossed her face. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. "It means," Judge Stokes replied, leaning forward slightly, "that you will receive a sentence designed not only to hold you accountable but to teach you the value of empathy and responsibility." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Judge Stokes continued, his voice steady and deliberate. "In addition to paying restitution for Mr. Jones's medical expenses and completing a mandatory driving safety course, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the Brookfield Community Shelter." Chantal blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You want me to what?" "Work at a homeless shelter." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and even her lawyer appeared momentarily stunned. Chantal's reaction, however, was anything but quiet. She leaned forward, her tone incredulous. "That's ridiculous. I don't belong in some shelter. That's not my problem." Judge Stokes remained calm, though his gaze hardened. "On the contrary, Miss Rivers," he said, "it is precisely that mindset, that inability to see beyond your own privilege, that makes this sentence necessary." The gallery buzzed with quiet approval, the murmurs growing as people exchanged glances. Chantal, however, was visibly seething. She opened her mouth to protest again, but Judge Stokes raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "This is not a punishment, Miss Rivers," he said, his voice firm. "This is an opportunity. An opportunity to see the world through a lens other than your own. An opportunity to understand the challenges faced by those who have not been afforded the privileges you so easily take for granted." Chantal slumped back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath. Judge Stokes ignored her comment, his focus shifting to the gallery. "Let the record show," he said, addressing the court reporter, "that this sentence is issued not out of spite, but out of a belief in rehabilitation through understanding. Miss Rivers will report to the Brookfield Community Shelter at 8 a.m. each morning for the duration of her sentence. Her progress will be monitored by the shelter's director, and any failure to comply will result in additional penalties." Turning his attention back to Chantal, he added, "Should you fail to meet the terms of this sentence, Miss Rivers, I assure you that the consequences will be far less favorable. Do I make myself clear?" Chantal glared at him, her jaw clenched tightly. For a moment, it seemed as though she might lash out again, but the intensity of Judge Stokes's gaze held her in check. Finally she muttered, "Fine. Whatever." Judge Stokes adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Miss Rivers," he said, his tone softening slightly, "this is not about humiliation or punishment. This is about growth. And while I cannot force you to change, I can create an environment where change is possible. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." He turned his attention briefly to Mr. Jones, who sat quietly in the gallery, his arms still in a sling. "Mr. Jones has shown grace and forgiveness in asking for a chance for you to learn from the experience," Judge Stokes said. "I suggest you honor that." Chantal glanced at Mr. Jones, her expression unreadable. For the first time she seemed genuinely uncomfortable, her defiance cracking under the weight of the moment. Judge Stokes picked up his gavel. "This court is adjourned," he announced, bringing the gavel down with a decisive crack. The room erupted into murmurs as the gallery began to empty. Chantal remained seated, her face a mixture of disbelief and indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she barely acknowledged him. As the door swung open and reporters began filing in, Chantal knew her name would be in tomorrow's headlines, but for reasons she never expected. Outside the courthouse the crowd was already buzzing. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, eager to capture the fallout from the dramatic hearing. Chantal's usual bravado surfaced momentarily as she pushed past them, snapping no comment, before climbing into a waiting car. Inside, however, her composure began to crack. As the courthouse faded into the distance, she stared out the window, her thoughts uncharacteristically quiet. For the first time, the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. The journey she was about to embark on was one she never anticipated, and one she couldn't escape. Monday morning arrived colder than usual. A biting wind cutting through the air as Chantal Rivers stood outside the Brookfield Community Shelter. Her oversized coat hung loosely around her shoulders, the designer bag in her hand completely out of place in the humble surroundings. The shelter was a modest brick building tucked into a quiet corner of town. Volunteers and staff bustled through the doors, their hurried movements contrasting sharply with Chantal's reluctant, frozen stance. She glanced at her watch, letting out an audible sigh. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, though no one was around to hear her. Her driver had already sped off, leaving her to face the day ahead. Inside, the shelter was warm and bustling with activity. The scent of coffee and freshly baked bread lingered in the air, mingling with the faint hum of voices and the occasional clang of a kitchen utensil. At the reception desk stood Marcy Taylor, the shelter's director, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a quiet kindness that immediately put people at ease. Marcy glanced up from her clipboard as Chantal entered, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the young woman before her. "You must be Chantal," she said, her tone friendly but firm. Chantal gave a half-hearted smile, pulling her sunglasses off with a theatrical flourish. "That's me," she said, her voice laced with her usual indifference. "Where do I work or whatever?" Marcy raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on the tone. "Follow me," she said, motioning for Chantal to walk with her. Marcy led Chantal through the shelter, pointing out the different areas. "This is the main dining hall," she explained as they passed a large room filled with tables and chairs. A group of volunteers was busy setting up for breakfast, their chatter blending with the occasional laughter from the guests who had already arrived. "Over there is the kitchen, and down that hall are the storage rooms and offices." Chantal barely nodded, her gaze flitting over the scene with mild disinterest. "So what exactly am I supposed to do?" she asked, her tone bordering on impatience. Marcy stopped and turned to face her. "You're here to help," she said plainly. "That could mean serving meals, cleaning tables, organizing donations, whatever is needed at the time. Everyone here does their part." Chantal crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "Right. Got it." Marcy didn't miss the attitude but chose to focus on the task at hand. "Let's start you off in the kitchen," she said, leading Chantal through a swinging door into the bustling space. Inside, steam rose from large pots on the stove, and the clatter of dishes filled the air. Volunteers moved efficiently, each person focused on their task. "This is Jake, one of our lead cooks," Marcy said, introducing a tall man in an apron who looked up from a cutting board with a welcoming smile. "He'll show you what to do." Chantal gave a small wave, clearly reluctant, as Jake handed her an apron. "Welcome to the team," he said. "We've got some vegetables that need chopping. Think you can handle that?" Chantal hesitated, glancing at her manicured nails. "Seriously? You want me to chop vegetables?" Jake chuckled. "Yep. Welcome to the glamorous world of community service." The hours dragged. Chantal fumbled with the knife, her lack of skill and enthusiasm painfully obvious to anyone watching. Her chopping was uneven, her movements slow, and her sighs frequent. Jake offered guidance, but it was clear that Chantal wasn't interested in improving. By midday she had been reassigned to the dining hall, tasked with serving meals. As guests lined up with trays, Chantal barely looked at them, her motions robotic and detached. The other volunteers worked with practiced ease, chatting with the guests and offering smiles. Chantal, in contrast, maintained a distant silence, her disinterest palpable. "Thank you," one woman said softly as Chantal placed a plate on her tray. Chantal didn't respond, her gaze already drifting elsewhere. Later that afternoon, Chantal found herself wiping down tables after the lunch rush. The dining hall was quieter now, the guests having returned to their rooms or headed back out into the cold. As she worked, an older woman approached her, steps slow but deliberate. "Mind if I sit here?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. Chantal glanced up, momentarily startled. Sure, she said, stepping aside. The woman sat down, folding her hands neatly on the table. You're new here, she observed. Yep, Chantal replied shortly, returning to her task. The woman smiled faintly. I'm Mrs. Ella James. Been coming to this shelter for a few months now. Lost my home when my husband passed. Didn't think I'd ever end up in a place like this, but life has a funny way of humbling you. Chantal paused, her rag hovering over the table. She hadn't expected a conversation, much less one so direct. I'm Chantal, she said finally, though she didn't meet Mrs. James's eyes. Nice to meet you, Chantal, the older woman said. You know, I've seen a lot of folks come through this place down on their luck, some trying to find their way. But the ones who make it, they're the ones who learn to see past themselves. Chantal frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. Mrs. James didn't wait for her. You're lucky, you know, she continued. Lucky to have the chance to learn that lesson before life teaches it the hard way. Chantal opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. Mrs. James smiled again, a knowing look in her eyes, before rising from her seat and walking away. That night, as Chantal sat in her car waiting for her driver to return, Mrs. James's words echoed in her mind. For the first time she began to wonder if this ridiculous sentence might actually mean something. The faces of the people she'd seen that day, the gratitude in their smiles, the quiet resilience in their eyes, lingered in her thoughts. As the car pulled away from the shelter, Chantal leaned her head against the window, her usual arrogance replaced by an unfamiliar sense of discomfort. The world outside her privileged bubble was beginning to feel less like a punishment and more like an opportunity. And while she wasn't ready to admit it yet, something inside her had shifted, just enough to plant the seed of change. The following week began much like the first for Chantal Rivers. Each morning she arrived at the Brookfield Community Shelter at precisely 8 a.m., her reluctance hidden beneath layers of designer coats and oversized sunglasses. But while her exterior remained polished, the cracks in her armor were becoming more apparent. The grueling hours and unfamiliar environment were slowly chipping away at the entitlement she wore so proudly. At first, Chantal approached her tasks with the same detached air she had on her first day, mechanical, silent, and barely present. But something had shifted after her conversation with Mrs. Ella James. The words had lingered, growing louder in her mind with each passing day. Though she would never admit it, Chantal was beginning to see the shelter and its people in a new light. One morning, Marcy Taylor assigned Chantal to the donation sorting room, a dimly lit space filled with boxes of clothing, shoes, and household items. The work was tedious, folding, organizing, and labeling, but it provided Chantal with something she hadn't experienced in years: time to reflect. As she sifted through the boxes, she found herself pausing over certain items. A pair of scuffed sneakers, a tattered teddy bear missing one button eye, a worn winter coat with patches sewn over the elbows. Each object told a story, and for the first time Chantal began to wonder about the people behind them. Who had donated these things and who would be receiving them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind her. Need some help? She turned to see a boy no older than 10 standing in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of an oversized hoodie. His name was Jamal, one of the shelter's youngest guests. He had been shy around Chantal at first, watching her from a distance but never speaking. Chantal hesitated. Sure, she said awkwardly, handing him a small stack of sweaters. Just fold these, I guess. Jamal took the sweaters and began folding with surprising precision. They worked in silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. My mom says we might get to move into our own place soon, he said, his voice tinged with cautious hope. She says it's because of people like you who help here. Chantal froze, unsure how to respond. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't here by choice, that this wasn't her idea of helping, but the sincerity in his voice stopped her. That's good, she said finally, her tone softer than usual. I hope it works out. Jamal looked up at her and smiled, a genuine toothy grin that caught her off guard. For the first time, Chantal felt something other than frustration or obligation. She felt the faint stirrings of purpose. The days that followed brought more moments like these. Small, quiet interactions that began to chip away at Chantal's defenses. One afternoon she sat in the dining hall during a break, watching as volunteers and guests mingled over cups of coffee. The lines between the two groups seemed to blur as laughter and conversation filled the room. Marcy sat down across from her, placing 2 steaming mugs of tea on the table. "You're doing better," she said simply, handing one to Chantal. Chantal raised an eyebrow. "Better at what?" "At being here," Marcy replied. "At seeing people." Chantal took a sip of tea, her gaze drifting to a group of women chatting nearby. One of them was Mrs. Ella James, her warm smile lighting up the room as she told a story that had the others laughing. "They've been through a lot," Marcy continued, her tone thoughtful. "Loss, hardship, things most people can't imagine. But they're still here, still fighting. That kind of strength is something you can't learn from a book or a paycheck." Chantal didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched as Mrs. James reached out to comfort a woman who had begun to cry. The scene was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. "I've never had to fight for anything," Chantal admitted quietly, almost to herself. Marcy smiled gently. "Maybe it's time you started." By the end of her second week, Chantal's transformation was undeniable. She no longer avoided eye contact with the shelter's guests, and her tasks were no longer completed with the bare minimum effort. She began greeting people by name, asking about their days, and even volunteering to take on additional work. One evening, as she helped clean up after dinner, Mrs. James approached her with a small stack of thank you notes. "The kids made these," she said, handing them to Chantal. "For all the volunteers. They wanted you to have one." Chantal flipped through the cards, her eyes landing on one written in shaky, childlike handwriting. "Thank you for helping us. You make the world better." The words hit her harder than she expected. For so long she had believed that her world revolved around wealth, status, and appearances. But here in this modest shelter she had found something far more meaningful. A connection to others and a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. At the end of her 30-day sentence, Chantal returned to the Brookfield courthouse. The courtroom felt different this time, less intimidating, more familiar. She stood before Judge Stokes, her posture no longer defiant but steady and composed. "Miss Rivers," Judge Stokes began, his tone as measured as ever, "you've completed your sentence at the Brookfield Community Shelter. Before we close this case, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the experience." Chantal hesitated, glancing at the gallery where Marcy, Jamal, and Mrs. James sat among the spectators. For once, her words didn't come easily. "It was eye-opening," she said finally. "At first I thought it was just a punishment, but I realized it was more than that. I got to see what real strength looks like, and I got to see how small my problems are compared to what others face every day." Judge Stokes nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Do you believe you've learned anything, Miss Rivers?" "Yes," Chantal said, her voice steady. "I've learned that privilege doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just means you have a responsibility to do better." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Judge Stokes's mouth. "A wise conclusion," he said. "Miss Rivers, I hope you carry this lesson with you beyond this courtroom. Your actions moving forward will determine whether this experience was truly transformative." Chantal nodded, a quiet determination in her eyes. "I will, Your Honor." As Chantal left the courthouse, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the town square. She paused on the steps, her gaze drifting toward the shelter in the distance. A few days later she returned, not as a court-ordered volunteer, but as someone who wanted to help. She greeted Marcy with a genuine smile and rolled up her sleeves, ready to get to work. For the first time in her life, Chantal Rivers understood the value of humility, responsibility, and empathy. And with that understanding she began to rebuild her life, not from the foundation of privilege, but from the strength of character she had finally found. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.